Margaret Thatcher's dead!
If you think the world is a mess now, that just means you weren't around in the 1970s. In Britain, where I grew up, the low point was known as the Winter of Discontent, a line borrowed from Shakespeare's Richard III. The inflation rate in 1975 was 27%. The trains were always late, the payphones were always broken, nothing worked. Worst of all were the recurrent strikes. Strikes by coal miners, strikes by dockers, strikes by printers, strikes by refuse collectors, strikes even by gravediggers. It felt as if there was no way back.
So Mr. Ferguson is bringing up Britain in the 1970s, which is often used as a time period to justify Thatcher's policies that pretty much left the working class destitute. Now, Mr. Ferguson is correct in the fact that there was some inflation and relative inefficiency, but what he doesn't give is the overall picture of the British economy in this time. What he doesn't tell you is that in the late 1970s, there was actually optimism in the British economy as North Sea oil was building up Britain's wealth. What he also doesn't tell you is that this was also a time where the worker share of the national income was at its highest and that unemployment was actually relatively low. In fact, inflation was actually falling and the overall British economy was growing at a relatively reasonable pace.
And then came Margaret Thatcher. Between May 1979, when she entered 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, and November 1990, when she stepped down, she changed everything.
Oh, sure, as long as you consider that change to be throwing millions of people out of work and into impoverishment, of course. And that's really funny, because people often credit her as the one who saved the British economy, when in reality, the recovery of the British economy was basically inevitable, because of the North Sea oil money. Let's also not forget about the fact that she wasted a lot of that money on tax cuts, instead of, investing that money in the British economy, whether that be through investing in new industries, better infrastructure, really just anything. Now, I'm actually going to skip about a minute into the video because the next minute or so is just Ferguson talking about how Thatcher got into politics, so yeah, we're going to skip that.
As early as 1975, Thatcher had come up with a wonderful line about the opposition Labour Party. They've got the usual socialist disease. They've run out of other people's money.
Now, I will totally admit that's some good propaganda, okay? But in the case of Thatcher, it is fucking hysterical. And the reason why it's so hysterical is because Thatcher's a fucking hypocrite. Again, here, I'll say it again. Thatcher blew UK North Sea oil windfall money.
This she contrasted memorably with what she called the British inheritance. A man's right to work as he will, to spend what he earns, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master.
Wow, Prager University is pulling out all of their greatest Margaret Thatcher jokes today. It's funny because Margaret Thatcher was the person who used state repression and police power to beat the fuck out of the trade union movement. So this little thing right here, that's fucking hilarious.
This was the essence of Thatcherism, and it was just the tonic that the patient, the British economy, needed. It's fashionable nowadays to argue that there was no Thatcher miracle in the 1980s. Not only is that demonstrably false, it misses an essential point. Thatcherism wasn't just about raising productivity or creating jobs. Just as important was the goal of defeating inflation and restoring prosperity to the middle class. This it emphatically achieved.
No, just no. Thatcher resided over some of Britain's worst unemployment since the Great Depression. Not just that, but inflation was already falling even before Thatcher got into office. Also, when Thatcher was in office, the percentage of people living below the poverty line skyrocketed from 13.4% to 22.2%. What makes this worse is the fact that Neil Ferguson, the person in this video, is a fucking historian.
Yet the event that more than any other defined Margaret Thatcher's premiership was not economic, but military. The Falklands War against Argentina established her irrevocably in the public mind as the new Britannia, a warrior queen who gloried in victory. And of course it ensured a Conservative win in the 1983 election.
You actually might be surprised to find out that the invasion of the Falklands by Argentina is actually largely the fault of Thatcher's government. So, first of all, in 1981, Thatcher's government decommissioned the only armed ship in the South Atlantic and implemented the 1981 Nationality Act. which denied the Falklanders British citizenship. Mind you, these islands have been disputed territory since like the 19th century, so you really have to think about it as, well, what kind of message does this send to Argentina? Well, it kind of sends the message that, hey, we don't really give a fuck about those islands. So it was basically the Thatcher government's fault that the invasion fucking happened in the first place.
Along with her ideological soulmate, US President Ronald Reagan, she was unhesitating in her opposition to the Soviet Union. When the Soviets deployed intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe, she fully supported, despite fierce opposition, Reagan's countermove to send American cruise and Pershing missiles to Western Europe.
Now, obviously, I don't like the Soviet Union. I'm not a tanky. I'm not an authoritarian. I'm very critical of the Soviet Union. But is this really a crowning achievement? Opposing an authoritarian state? Really? This is an achievement?
Okay.
It's still terribly hard for those who opposed her to admit it. But Margaret Thatcher was right about most things.
Bullshit.